I'm Kathleen Martens, sitting in for Sierra Bettens. Welcome to In Focus. On this episode, we're looking at treaty rights and the Alberta separatist movement. Laws have been passed, and even a question on Alberta's exit from Canada is out on social media. So what does this mean for treaty rights in Alberta?
If people aren't happy in this beautiful country that we're building together, then you're free to go and live wherever you want, but you can take the dirt that, maybe your ancestors brought with them when they came over here from, other places. That's the only piece of land that you're going to take, but you're not going to take any treaty land, any inherent land from any of our First Nations people across our beautiful country.
That was the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanek, speaking on a recent panel. Not since the two Quebec referendums of the 1980s and 90s on sovereignty has there been so much debate over a province leaving Canada. In Alberta, it started up in 2022 when the province passed the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act, better known as the Sovereignty Act. Throughout the federal election, some prominent Albertans were warning that another Liberal government would be a risk to national unity. Canadians ignored the warning and elected the Liberals to a strong minority government. The day after Mark Carney was elected Prime Minister, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith introduced Bill 54 that rankled many people, including treaty nations across the province. Matthew Wildcat is an assistant professor and director of Indigenous governance in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. He is Plains Cree and grew up in Maskwacis and is a member of Ermineskin First Nation. Let's start with the Sovereignty Act, Matthew. What is it?
So the Sovereignty Act is from a few years ago now, and the main purpose of it is the Alberta government wanted the ability to be more, you could call it forceful and aggressive in their relationship with Ottawa. And so they passed an act which would, give them the prerogative to be, more direct in their negotiations. But, the act, it hasn't been tested in any sort of significant legal way. Onion Lake originally had a lawsuit against the federal government when the act was first unveiled, and I hear now that Onion Lake is reviving that lawsuit.
That's right. Yes, they've resurrected it. Okay, so what is it about this law then that has Onion Lake and others lashing out at the province?
The concern is that the province is acting unilaterally, that it can, make decisions about the, land and territory in Alberta without having to consult or work with or partner with First Nations, or, you could also call them treaty holders in any sort of fashion, right? And so that's the big concern, is that the province of Alberta is acting in a manner where they're ignoring the rights and sovereignties of Indigenous people.
Okay, so now there's Bill 54 that passed as an amendment to the Sovereignty Act. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Bill 54 is, it's just a bill that lowers the threshold for people to trigger, I think they might even use the term like citizen-led referendum. Previously, the bar had been quite high. It required, hundreds of thousands of people to sign a petition. And I think they had a window of about 30 days to do so. I would have to look up the exact numbers, but I think now the bar has been lowered down to you need about somewhere between like 150 to 200,000 signatures, and then you get an extended window now too. You get, I think, 90 days or maybe 60 days as compared to the what it was previously. I believe it was 30.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. It's about 200,000 signatures now.
Okay.
So you've told APTN News that treaty rights are the biggest obstacle to Alberta separating. Why is that?
I think I was even a bit more specific. I think treaty rights are the biggest obstacle to the legitimacy of Alberta separating, right? So, when we look at the long history of how borders have been drawn in North America, these are colonial borders, right? Like the U.S.-Canada border, how the province of Alberta all of these borders were largely drawn without the input of Indigenous peoples. And so in a big history sense, all of these borders are colonial borders to begin with. And, the rationale behind them finds its basis in colonial law. And so, because of that, I don't think we should necessarily, Indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignties are recognized much more significantly today than they were in, say, 1965, right? Where, basically I think, Canada and the US were still hoping at some level that Indigenous peoples would cease to exist as legal and political collectives. And, and so now obviously today, Aboriginal rights and title and treaty rights are recognized in all sorts of ways by the Canadian government, but I don't think we should assume that colonial governments are above making decisions unilaterally without us either, right? And so that's why I don't think treaty rights are the most significant obstacle, because probably there's other factors at play in relation to the economy, negotiations with Canada, but from a legitimacy perspective of like, can this be done in a just and fair manner? There's absolutely no scenario I see that this could be done in a just and fair manner without including Indigenous peoples as full partners from the get-go. And not only full partners, but full partners who have the ability to put conditions upon how something like this might happen, right? And so I think when if Alberta was serious about doing that, they would soon find that probably First Nations are putting conditions on them, which changes the calculus of how this looks like entirely, right? And hence why I think Alberta is going forward with this without consulting Indigenous peoples, barely at all, or really not at all, in fact. So, and so that's why I think treaty rights pose the biggest obstacle to legitimacy for this looking like it's like this is a fair and free and lawful thing to do, and not something that is just another enactment of colonial law where you have non-Indigenous peoples deciding the fate of Indigenous peoples.
What would happen, though, with the land that the tar sand sits on, for example? There's a lot of money in those pieces of land.
Absolutely. So, I was joking around with somebody, and I was saying, if the government of Alberta came and, their opening offer was, we're going to give you 50% of the land of Alberta, and we're going to give you mineral rights to all of those lands, then, you might start to think differently about, okay, maybe that's a pretty good offer, right? And so it's not as if there's not a scenario in which Alberta separation could be done in a way that Indigenous peoples come out ahead. But is there a willingness on the part of the Alberta government, on the part of a separatist movement, to entertain such a big radical transfers of land where Indigenous peoples were controlling 50% or more of the province of Alberta? Like, almost guaranteed not, right? Like there's no world in which that is probably even remotely on the table. And so, we don't know what it would look like, because as far as we know, this would all, Indigenous peoples there would be no benefits or rights extended to us in any sort of way with the referendum. And so, you ask a question like, well, what would happen with that land? We don't know, because, part of it is we don't know what legal system is going to be applied to deal with questions of jurisdiction, property, title, these sorts of questions, right? And so are we going to use Canadian law? Are we going to use some sort of newfound like Alberta law that could be like deeply colonial? Or are we going to use Indigenous laws, right? And so if we use Indigenous laws, then obviously, the answer is that the vast majority of that land should probably be fully in control of Indigenous peoples, especially under a scenario where we're changing up the status quo and reimagining what jurisdiction looks like in Alberta. But we don't know what legal system would actually be applied to working through these questions of jurisdiction.
Right. Okay. So what's your opinion on how chiefs in Alberta should approach this now?
Mm-hmm. So, for me, part of how I see it is, I think there's two things going on, right? So there's the threat of separation, and that is a grave threat. And I think an outcome that would almost certainly disadvantage Indigenous peoples. There's very little in Alberta's current political climate, but also historically, to suggest that Alberta would treat Indigenous peoples better than Canada. Like, obviously there are, some small things like, the Alberta government did create the Métis settlements and there's been, premiers in the past which have been very sympathetic to Indigenous peoples in some, minor ways. I'm thinking of Ralph Klein and Peter Lougheed, who had relationships with Indigenous peoples and, some understanding of our issues. But certainly given the current climate, things would look worse if we were to separate, right? So that's a real threat, and it should be taken seriously. But at the end of the day, you look at all of the hoops and obstacles that would have to the Alberta government would have to jump through in order for this to actually happen. I think it's an incredibly small chance that Alberta is going to separate, right? And so I think that threat, while it has to be attended to, is not the primary threat. For me, the primary threat is not separation, but the separatist movement, right? And the separatist movement, I think we should distinguish from the outcome of separation, because the separatist movement could continue on, for a generation or more of people who are very organized and motivated, who want to push this agenda of Alberta separation. And even if they're never successful, they're going to change the political landscape of Alberta because of any sort of power that they might flex electorally. And so I think you see that a little bit already with the fact that Danielle Smith is the premier. When the United Conservative Party had their leadership race, they did a ranked ballot. So the final leader had to receive 50% of the votes, right? And so I believe it was all other 7 candidates at one point spoke out, said anyone but Danielle Smith to their supporters that, rank her last. And, the first ballot, I think Danielle Smith had around 45, maybe 46%, but, she was below that threshold, right? And so they had to go through all 7 rounds until it was just her and one other candidate. And then she just barely broke the threshold, right? And so we know that, this group is motivated to engage in party politics and can influence outcomes, as we see with the election of Danielle Smith to the party leadership of the UCP. And we don't know what other ways in which they might flex their electoral and political power. And that should be scary to the Chiefs, not because they want to separate from Canada, which is an unlikely outcome, but because I think there's a whole other set of politics that this group of people has. One of which I think is that I think until they say otherwise, I think we should treat this group as people who believe in assimilation. I think this is a group of people who believe that Indigenous people shouldn't have any legal and political rights. So like in a newfound Republic of Alberta or whatever you want to call it, they probably think that Aboriginal and treaty rights will go away. They'll cease to exist, right? And so this is I think a grave threat to have a very motivated, dedicated voting bloc which doesn't believe in Indigenous rights. And I think that is the real danger, actually, is the persistence, an emboldened and motivated separatist movement in Alberta. And I think that movement will become more emboldened if there is a referendum to begin with, partially because they'll be funded publicly in order to run a campaign, to create a separated Alberta. But it will also give them the time and space and energy to test out their strategies around what connects with people, potentially grow their base, bring even more people into their tent, and give themselves the motivation and wherewithal to continue to fight a separatist movement, which I think we should assume is a de facto assimilationist movement, that Indigenous peoples should not have distinct legal and political standing in Canada.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in here and just say that we don't know that that's their position, but that's what your concern is, that it could be their position.
We definitely don't know that it's their position, but I think but we do have some indication, right? So one, Danielle Smith in her own comments has said that the referendum is necessary because otherwise this group will grow so restless that they could form their own political party. They could separate, and the conservative tent in Alberta will become fractured, right? And it will allow the NDP to walk up the middle. So she's catering to this group of people. But in doing the Sovereignty Act, in lowering the threshold to have a referendum and not engaging with Indigenous peoples at all, and also having this huge outpouring of protests from Indigenous peoples that she has yet to respond to in any sort of substantive way, all leads me to believe that she doesn't feel the need to take Indigenous rights and title very seriously, right? But then we have other traces on social media of the way in which people who believe in separatism have responded to posts about treaty rights, where people are just kind of blatantly saying, well, Indigenous peoples won't have any rights anymore, right? So I think until that movement, what the chiefs should be doing is, until that movement makes a statement otherwise, they should be treated as a de facto separatist movement. And I think the chiefs need to make political statements in order to draw that out from them.
So you'd like to hear them actually state that there should or shouldn't be a vote, a referendum?
I think the chiefs, they should come out against having a referendum to begin with, is important. But I also think that, they need to, there needs to be some political strategy to get this separatist movement to make firm, formal statements about Indigenous peoples, like what they actually believe about Indigenous peoples. Because I think they could do this through, they have various regional organizations which are capable of making statements. But, if we look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one of the clauses state Indigenous peoples are allowed to create representative institutions of their own making, right? And so we typically think of that as like, at the community level, right? Or, at the level of individual First Nation governments, that people can operate their government however they want. But we could also think about it at a regional level. I think it's within the chief's power to create, I would call it something like a special assembly, where they gather and they pass a political statement. And they could have a province-wide special assembly on this issue to pass a political position or a declaration or a statement of some kind, which would state their position about Alberta separation. But I think also hopefully put the separatist movement, but also the UCP and the Premier of Alberta in a position where they're forced to respond to what they actually believe about Indigenous people's rights and sovereignties. And I think in doing so, I think there's a really strong possibility that the separatist movement actually has very outdated and potentially very harmful views about Indigenous peoples. And that needs to be brought out into the open if this political struggle is going to be waged moving forward.
Really good stuff there, Matthew. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen.
Matthew Wildcat teaches Native Studies at the University of Alberta. When the Sovereignty Act passed in 2022, Onion Lake Cree Nation, a community that straddles the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, wasted no time in relaunching a lawsuit. It claims that the Sovereignty Act infringes on Onion Lake's treaty rights. According to the band's leadership, Alberta has yet to respond to its lawsuit. The talk of Alberta separation has raised the ire of other treaty chiefs in Alberta as well. But what does the Sovereignty Act actually mean in terms of treaty rights and the province of Alberta? Gina Starblanket is an associate professor in the School of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria. She is Cree Saulteaux and a member of the Star Blanket Cree Nation in Treaty 4, otherwise known as Saskatchewan. Gina, what did you make of the Sovereignty Act when you first came across it?
Well, it was pretty concerning to me as someone who does work on treaty, as someone who, is trained in Canadian and constitutional politics and law in Canada. There's a number of very clear violations, or at least, areas where the Act doesn't adequately account for or demonstrate an understanding of the foundations of this country, including its own laws, as well as Indigenous understandings of treaty.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it would just kind of pretend that constitutional law and Canadian law don't exist, and this is a new Alberta, and we don't have those things here?
I'm not sure, and that's part of the problem, is that they haven't been, very direct or explicit around how, the proponents of separatism would plan on crafting a position that would ensure that Aboriginal rights, and treaty relationships are respected and upheld. We know, that according to Canada's own constitution, under the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Crown is required to negotiate treaties with any Indigenous people whose lands it wants to enter into. And the proclamation also recognizes, to a limited extent, Indigenous political authority and sovereignty over those territories. So for any government to be able to enter into those territories, they have to enter into a royal proclamation process of treaty making. And of course, the provinces are not our partners under treaty. The Crown is. We negotiated treaties with the Crown. And so my question, in the absence of any kind of clear indication of how, separatism might actually be negotiated in a way that upholds those existing relationships. My question is, how would the separatists or their supporters ever claim or conceptualize having a land base, given that they're not partners to treaty in these territories? They would have to essentially strike a new royal proclamation process and begin treaty negotiations with Indigenous peoples of these places.
That's a good question. Okay, so let me go over to Quebec. They wanted a new sovereign relationship with Canada when they went through their separatist period, for lack of a better word. Is that possible for Alberta?
It's a complicated question. These things don't just happen because we declare them unilaterally. There's a number of conditions that would have to be satisfied for that to be possible, including, not just a referendum, but the negotiation of some sort of constitutional amendment with other provinces that form part of the federal structure and with the federal government. Now, of course, the federal government has a number of different obligations and responsibilities under the treaty to Indigenous people and territories. That's built into our Constitution. It's under Section 91(2)(4). We have Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and upheld under Section 35. And so, there's a number of questions and considerations that would have to be addressed, much like, the matter of the provinces not being a part of treaties, before anything like that could even be contemplated. And that actually, the order of these things matters a great deal because, voters would have to be also informed of how the province plans on upholding its, not its duties, but the Crown's responsibilities to Indigenous people and lands. That would have to be made clear at the point of referendum so people know the totality of the implications of what they're voting for. And even if it made it beyond that point, it would require extensive, in-depth constitutional negotiations whereby the federal government would be in a position to ensure that its obligations to Indigenous people of these treaty territories are not eclipsed by this sort of move or discarded, wholeheartedly.
Yeah, you paint a picture of a great deal of complexity, a lot of a legal lasagna, if you will, like so many layers of who would have to get involved and agree and sign off. And this is all without First Nations they haven't even been consulted about this. They haven't been asked to the table. They haven't been asked if they're interested and they want to do it. And here we're asking, you and others to envision all the steps that it would require. And it sounds like it would also take a very long time.
Yeah, it would be bogged down in, constitutional and treaty-based legal and political challenges for years, even if a constitutional amendment were to be successfully negotiated, which I actually think that's very aspirational. I think, Quebec showed us that, there can be certainly localized support, and expressions of difference and a sense of alienation and disconnection. from the federal government and its priorities. It also taught us that people are not very keen to quickly reopen constitutional matters and vote for, substantive constitutional changes, particularly when Indigenous people haven't been adequately engaged. And when I say adequately, I mean, we're not even being properly engaged now within the nation-to-nation relationship that was envisioned in treaties. I don't want to be suggesting or interpreted as suggesting that I'm in favor of the current federal structure or its constitution or the current, state of political relations, which is one of Indigenous political subordination across Canada to both provincial and federal governments. That has to be transformed so that Indigenous people are given more political authority and taken more seriously than we have been in the past, because we know that it has not been adequate in the past or in the present.
Now, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations has invited Alberta to leave with the dirt it arrived with. That's a comment that she made on a recent panel. And I'm wondering, is that really what this would all boil down to?
Well, I mean, I think that the effect of even just these conversations and the referendum it's not a good one, right? It's galvanizing greater division. A lot of these sorts of this sort of impulse is based in very racist, colonial, capitalist logics. It's emboldening the sense of white settler righteousness and entitlement in these spaces. And the movement is based on hate, not on building relationship or dialogue or, even the conditions necessary to bring forward more transparent and mutual dialogue or relationship. So, it is concerning, and it's I think something that isn't going to be moving in the direction of decolonization or reconciliation or whatever sort of, label you want to put on the various movements toward change that we're seeing. They're all trying to change the relationship for the better, not for worse. And I think this would have the effect of, it already has the effect, I think, of creating greater division, validating people in their sort of racist and entitled views that they might already hold.
Mm-hmm. Legally, what does separation mean for treaty nations in Alberta?
Well, our relationships, and again, I'm not just speaking from Treaty 4 because that's where I'm from, which is, across all three provinces. A lot of people don't really register the fact that Treaty 4 does cover part of, what Alberta claims as its own boundaries. But I think there's two things. In one sense, it means nothing because the province is not our treaty partner. And the province actually is not within its mandate to have responsibility over Indigenous people and lands, though many of the areas that it does have jurisdiction absolutely impact Indigenous freedom, Indigenous lives in the everyday. And so, the province can say that it's going to separate, we can declare all sorts of things, but it means very little unless it follows, the process of the Canadian laid out in the Canadian Constitution. Or rather, by the Clarity Act, rather. But, there's a number of obligations within the Constitution that the Crown holds towards Indigenous people that it would be violating because it's been delegated, a number of responsibilities that do impact Indigenous people. So it means, in one sense, it means very little because there's not a lot of legs and there's nothing but, barriers that stand in the way. It's not like one of our treaty partners is leaving the relationship. We've actually never considered the province to be a treaty partner. But on the other hand, it is concerning, socially. I know you asked legally, but socially it is concerning in terms of the climate that it's going to continue to cultivate, right, through this movement. Legally, again, just going back to that question, there's a number of different matters that would have to be negotiated. And so constitutional change would be required not just in terms of the federal structure, but also in terms of how Canada is going to grapple with its obligations and responsibilities under the treaty, of which it has many that we're only actually starting, to challenge Canada on, today in the courts. Well, something like the NRTA, the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, Indigenous people have been, challenging that since as a violation of treaty since it occurred. However, we're only now, sort of mobilizing and trying to, gather the funds and create a unified movement to challenge the NRTA. So that's just an example of how, we've never really taken kindly to incursions onto our territory. That's why the Crown had to negotiate treaties in the first place, right? There was surveyors, there was, people trying to exercise powers of governance in these spaces. And so this would be a matter, that would have to be negotiated under a number of different sections of the Constitution. There were a number of various changes would be required. These include, Section 35, Section 91.24, but also even under Section 25 of the Charter, which upholds and protects Section 35.
Okay. Well, I thank you so much for this. I know it just kind of scratches the surface.
The important thing here is that the treaty is a relationship. It's not a transaction, an event that occurred, at one time in the past. It's an ongoing relationship, and it's absolutely, meant to be renewed and to change over time. However, it's not meant to change in a way that renders it less significant or important in terms of how these particular territories in the prairies are governed. The treaty is the governing framework. And so unless, there's a very clear indication of how treaties would be upheld as relationship frameworks between nations, I don't think that this movement has any legs to stand on.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Gina.
Of course, anytime.
Gina Starblanket is an associate professor at the University of Victoria. This episode of In Focus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko and hosted by me, Kathleen Martens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and a review. You can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth and Politics on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.